Hello, and welcome to Creepy Raindrops. Before you drift off to sleep, let me tell you a story. A story that will help you relax and fall into a deep, peaceful slumber. Sit or lie down comfortably, and let the world around you slowly fade away. Tonight, I will take you on a journey through the woods, where the air is cool and the shadows of the trees stretch long. As you listen, let your mind relax, your body feel heavy, and all the noise in your head gradually fade away. Before we begin, I'd like to know, which city are you listening to this story from? And what time is it there? The Cabin in the Blizzard. A nightmare in the cold December 1987, Lake Tahoe, California. It was an unusually harsh winter for Lake Tahoe, a place where snow often fell gently and painted the landscape with serene beauty. But on the night of December 14, 1987, the calm turned into chaos as a blizzard swept through the Sierra Nevada mountains, blanketing everything in sight with thick layers of snow. The winds howled like tormented spirits, and visibility dropped to almost nothing. It was during this storm that 5 friends, Emma, Daniel, Sarah, Mark, and Chris, found themselves stranded in a remote cabin they had rented for what was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway. The cabin, nestled deep within the woods near Echo Summit, was old but charming, or so it seemed when they arrived 2 days earlier under clear skies. Its wooden walls creaked softly in the wind, and the scent of pine filled the air. At first, it felt cozy, even magical, as they gathered around the fireplace, sharing laughter and stories late into the night. But now, surrounded by the relentless fury of the storm outside, the same walls felt suffocating, as though they were closing in with every passing hour. By midnight, the power went out. The generator sputtered and died after hours of struggling against the cold. Candles became their only source of light, casting flickering shadows that danced eerily across the room. Emma sat closest to the window, staring out at the endless white void beyond the glass. She swore she saw something moving out there, a dark shape shifting against the storm, but when she blinked, it was gone. Probably just tree branches, Daniel said dismissively, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. He adjusted his scarf tighter around his neck and glanced nervously toward the door. Sarah, who had been unusually quiet since dinner, suddenly spoke up. "Does anyone else feel watched?" Her words hung heavy in the air, unanswered. Mark tried to lighten the mood. "Come on, we're just spooked because of the storm. Let's play another game or something." But no one moved. The atmosphere inside the cabin had shifted subtly, growing colder despite the fire still crackling weakly in the hearth. Chris, ever the skeptic, leaned back in his chair and sighed. "This place is giving me the creeps," he admitted reluctantly. "I don't know why, but I can't shake the feeling that we're not alone here." As if on cue, a loud thud echoed from upstairs. Everyone froze, their eyes darting toward the ceiling. The sound was unmistakable. Something had fallen, or perhaps been thrown, onto the floor above them. "Maybe it's the wind," Emma suggested, though her trembling voice gave her away. Daniel stood up slowly, grabbing one of the flashlights. "I'll go check it out," he said, trying to sound braver than he felt. "No way," Sarah protested immediately. "We should stay together. Whatever it is, we shouldn't split up." The group hesitated, torn between fear and curiosity. Outside, the blizzard raged on, its icy fingers clawing at the windows. And then, from somewhere deep within the cabin, came the faintest whisper. A voice so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. But it wasn't the wind. Called their names. "Emma." The single word sent chills down everyone's spines. They looked at each other wide-eyed, unable to speak. None of them had said it. None of them dared to move. Chris finally broke the silence, his voice low and tense. "Okay, that wasn't us. Someone say something. Anything." No one responded. The whisper lingered in the air, a ghostly echo that refused to fade. Emma clutched the edge of her sweater, her knuckles turning white. "Did you hear that? Please tell me you heard that." "I heard it," Daniel confirmed, his flashlight beam shaking slightly as he scanned the room. "Let's stick together. We'll check upstairs as a group." Reluctantly, the others agreed. They gathered their candles and flashlights, forming a tight cluster as they approached the staircase. Each step creaked under their weight, amplifying the tension. The air grew colder with every step upward, and the faint smell of damp would mingled with something else. Something metallic, like rust or blood. When they reached the top landing, they paused. The hallway stretched before them, lined with closed doors. Shadows flickered wildly from their candlelight, creating grotesque shapes on the walls. Another whisper drifted toward them, louder this time. "Emma, come closer." Emma gasped, stumbling backward into Mark. "That's not possible. That's not." "Stay calm," Daniel interrupted, though his own voice wavered. "We need to figure out what's going on." They decided to start with the nearest door. Daniel pushed it open cautiously, revealing an empty bedroom. The bed was neatly made, the curtains drawn tightly shut. Nothing seemed out of place. One by one, they checked the other rooms, finding nothing but dust-covered furniture and cobwebs. Yet the whispers continued, growing more insistent, more personal. "Sarah, remember the lake?" Sarah froze mid-step, her face pale. "What did it just say?" she whispered hoarsely. "The lake," Mark repeated, confused. "What does that mean?" Sarah didn't answer. She stared straight ahead, her expression haunted. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely audible. "There was an accident. Years ago. I never told anyone about it." The group turned to her, stunned. Before anyone could ask further, a sudden gust of wind slammed the front door downstairs shut with a deafening crash. They rushed back down the stairs, hearts pounding, only to find the living room transformed. The furniture had been rearranged, the chairs overturned, and the fireplace extinguished. In the center of the room lay a photograph, partially buried under ash and snow that had blown in through cracks in the walls. Emma picked it up carefully, brushing off the debris. It depicted a group of people standing in front of the very cabin they were in now. Their faces were blurred, indistinct, but one figure stood out. A young woman wearing a red coat, her features eerily similar to Emma's. On the back of the photo, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "*, she will return." *. "What does this mean?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the temperature plummeted further. Frost began creeping along the walls, spreading rapidly like veins of ice. Then, from the corner of the room, came a low, guttural growl. They spun around, flashlights and candles illuminating the source. A shadowy figure hunched in the darkness, its form shifting unnaturally. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, raising his flashlight higher. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it lunged forward, faster than any of them could react. Chaos erupted as they scattered, dropping their lights and scrambling for cover. The candles went out, plunging the room into near-total darkness. "Get to the car," Chris shouted, his voice cracking with panic. But the storm outside showed no signs of relenting. Even if they managed to reach the vehicle, would it even start? Would they survive the journey back down the mountain? As they debated their next move, the whispers returned, louder and angrier. Names were called again, interspersed with fragmented phrases that made little sense. As the shadowy figure loomed closer, its form solidifying into something both human and grotesque, the group huddled together near the overturned furniture. The air was thick with frost, their breaths visible in short, panicked puffs. Emma clutched the photograph tightly in her hand, her mind racing to make sense of the impossible image she had seen. Her reflection, or rather her likeness, wasn't just part of the photo. It was central to whatever horror they were now trapped in. Chris grabbed a poker from the fireplace, brandishing it like a weapon. "Stay back!" he yelled, his voice cracking under the strain of fear. The figure paused, tilting its head as if amused by the feeble attempt at resistance. Then, without warning, it lunged again, faster than before. The group scattered, diving behind chairs and tables, desperate for cover. Sarah tripped over a fallen candlestick, landing hard on the icy floor. She screamed as the shadow advanced toward her, its elongated fingers reaching out. "Sarah!" Mark shouted, grabbing a nearby chair and hurling it at the creature. The impact caused it to stagger, giving Sarah just enough time to scramble away. "We can't fight it," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "We need to find another way out." But escape seemed impossible. The front door was blocked by the relentless force of the storm outside, and every window was sealed shut by layers of ice that refused to budge. Even worse, the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "Emma, you know what happened. The lake will take you. Leave while you still can." Emma pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they seeped into her mind like poison. Memories she had long buried began surfacing, unbidden and unwelcome. She remembered standing on the edge of a frozen lake years ago, staring down at the cracked surface. There had been laughter, then screams, and finally silence. Someone had fallen through the ice that day, but no one had ever found the body. "Emma?" Daniel's voice broke through her thoughts. "What do they mean? What happened at the lake?" She hesitated, tears streaming down her face. I don't want to talk about it." "You have to," Sarah urged, her own voice shaking. "Whatever this thing is, it knows. It's using your past against us." Reluctantly, Emma began to speak. "It was winter break during my sophomore year of college. A group of us went skating on Donner Lake. We were laughing, having fun, until someone fell through the ice. I tried to help, but—" her voice trailed off, choked with emotion. "Couldn't save her. I ran away because I was too scared to face what I'd done." The room fell silent except for the howling wind outside. The shadowy figure stopped moving, its head tilted as if listening intently. Then, slowly, it began to change. Its features shifted, becoming more defined, more familiar. When it stepped into the dim light of a flickering candle, they saw it clearly for the first time and gasped in horror. It was the girl from the photograph, the one who had drowned in the lake. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She wore the same red coat from the picture, now tattered and soaked with water that dripped steadily onto the floor. "You left me," the apparition whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You promised you'd come back for me." Emma collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what else to do." The others watched in stunned silence, unsure of how to intervene. The spirit ignored them, focusing solely on Emma. It reached out a hand, dripping with icy water, and touched her shoulder. The moment contact was made, Emma let out a blood-curdling scream. "Get away from her!" Daniel shouted, charging forward with the flashlight raised like a club. He swung wildly, striking the apparition across its translucent form. For a brief moment, it faltered, its shape wavering like smoke. "Run!" Chris yelled, seizing the opportunity. They bolted toward the staircase, hoping to put distance between themselves and the vengeful spirit. But as they reached the top landing, they realized their mistake. The second floor was no safer. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more frantic. Doors slammed shut on their own, trapping them in the narrow hallway. Mark tried opening one of the doors, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," he exclaimed, yanking on the handle. "Try the other ones," Sarah urged, her voice rising in panic. One by one, they tested each door, finding them all sealed tight, except for one. At the far end of the hall, a single door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. "Do we really want to go in there?" Chris asked, his skepticism warring with desperation. "We don't have a choice," Daniel replied grimly. They pushed the door open cautiously, revealing a small attic space cluttered with old furniture and boxes. In the center of the room sat an antique mirror, its surface clouded with age. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped even further, and the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling phrase. "Look into the mirror." None of them wanted to obey, but something compelled them to approach. One by one, they stared into the glass and recoiled in terror. Their reflections weren't normal. Instead of seeing themselves, They saw distorted versions of their faces, twisted with fear and guilt. Behind them, faint shapes moved in the background of the reflection, figures that weren't present in the real world. Emma was the last to look. When she did, her reflection wasn't hers at all. It was the drowned girl, staring back at her with accusing eyes. "You promised?" The reflection mouthed silently, before reaching out of the mirror and grabbing Emma's wrist. She screamed as the cold grip tightened, pulling her toward the glass. The others rushed to pull her back, but the force was too strong. The mirror seemed alive, its surface rippling like water as it dragged Emma closer. "Help me!" she cried, clawing at the frame. Daniel grabbed her waist, straining to hold on. "We're not letting go." But the mirror wasn't done with them. The attic began to shake violently, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The whispers turned into deafening shrieks, filling the air with unbearable noise. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The shaking ceased, the whispers faded, and the mirror returned to its ordinary, dusty state. Emma collapsed to the floor, drenched in sweat and shivering uncontrollably. The others looked around, disoriented and terrified. "What just happened?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, a soft knock echoed from downstairs. "Knock! Knock! Knock!" It came again, deliberate and steady, as though someone, or something, was waiting for them to respond. The knock reverberated through the cabin, each sound deliberate and unnervingly calm amidst the chaos that had just unfolded. It was as if the storm outside had paused, holding its breath along with the 5 friends frozen in place. The attic fell silent except for the faint creak of the wooden beams and the distant howl of the wind. "Who's there?" Daniel called out, his voice strained but firm. He clutched the flashlight tightly, its beam wavering slightly as he pointed it toward the staircase leading down to the main floor. No response came. Only another knock, 3 slow, measured taps against the front door. Chris exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "This is insane. No one could have gotten here in this storm." "Maybe it's not human," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Emma, still trembling from her encounter with the mirror, struggled to stand. Her wrist throbbed where the reflection had grabbed her, an icy burn lingering beneath her skin. She glanced at the others, her face pale. "We can't stay up here forever. We need to know what or who that is." Daniel nodded reluctantly. "Let's go down together. Stay close." They descended the stairs cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the thick layer of frost coating the wooden steps. The air grew colder with every step, and the oppressive weight of the cabin seemed to press down on them. When they reached the bottom, they hesitated near the living room entrance, peering toward the front door. The knocking came again, louder this time. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the cabin like a death knell. Mark swallowed hard. "What do we do? Open it or ignore it? If we don't answer, it might break the door down," Chris reasoned, though his tone betrayed his unease. "Better to face whatever it is than wait for it to come after us." Taking a deep breath, Daniel stepped forward, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. "Everyone stay behind me." As they approached the door, the whispers returned, softer now but no less menacing. They seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a chorus of voices overlapping in a language none of them could understand. Emma pressed her hands over her ears again, trying to block out the noise, but it seeped into her mind regardless. When they reached the door, Daniel paused, his hand hovering over the handle. "Ready?" he asked, glancing back at the group. No one responded, but their nods were enough. With a swift motion, he turned the handle and pulled the door open. A blast of frigid air rushed in, carrying with it a flurry of snowflakes that swirled around the room. Standing in the doorway was a figure cloaked in a heavy, hooded coat. Its face was obscured by shadows, but its presence radiated an aura of calm authority. "You shouldn't be here," the figure said, its voice low and steady, devoid of malice but laced with warning. "Who are you?" Daniel demanded, raising the flashlight to illuminate the stranger's face. The figure pushed back its hood, revealing an elderly man with weathered features and piercing blue eyes. His expression was unreadable, neither kind nor hostile. "My name is Henry. I live nearby. I saw your car when I was checking my traps and figured you might need help." Relief washed over the group, though it was tinged with suspicion. "You live out here?" Chris asked, incredulous. "In this storm?" Henry nodded. "I've lived in these woods for 40 years. Storms like this don't bother me much anymore. But you lot." He gestured toward them with a gloved hand. "You're not prepared for a night like this. Not in this cabin." "Why not?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Henry's gaze hardened. "That cabin has a history. Bad things have happened there. People vanish, accidents occur. Locals avoid it. Didn't you wonder why it was so cheap to rent?" Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Do you know about the lake?" Henry's eyes narrowed. "Ah, so you've met her already." "Her?" Mark repeated, confused. "The girl in the red coat," Henry explained. "She drowned in Donner Lake decades ago. Some say she haunts these woods, seeking those who wronged her. Others claim the cabin itself is cursed, drawing in lost souls and trapping them here. But we didn't do anything," Emma protested, tears welling up in her eyes. "I mean, yes, I was there when she died, but I didn't." "You ran," Henry interrupted, his tone sharp. "And running doesn't undo what's been done. She won't rest until she has answers or vengeance." "What do we do?" Daniel asked, desperation creeping into his voice. Henry considered this for a moment, then sighed. "There may be a way to appease her. Follow me." Without waiting for a response, he turned and stepped back into the storm. The group exchanged uneasy glances but ultimately decided to follow him. Staying in the cabin felt like signing their own death warrants. Outside, the blizzard raged on, the wind biting at their exposed skin despite their layers of clothing. Henry led them through the dense forest, his movements confident and unhindered by the treacherous terrain. They stumbled after him, clutching each other for support as the snow piled higher with every step. After what felt like hours, they arrived at a small, dilapidated shed tucked away among the trees. Inside, a fire crackled in a rusty wood stove, casting flickering shadows across the cramped space. Henry motioned for them to sit on the benches lining the walls. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice gentle yet commanding. Emma hesitated, then began recounting the events of the past few days. The strange occurrences in the cabin, the apparition in the mirror, and the whispers that wouldn't stop. As she spoke, Henry listened intently, nodding occasionally. When she finished, he leaned back, stroking his beard thoughtfully. "The spirit won't leave you alone until you confront her directly. You must return to the lake where it all began." "The lake," Sarah echoed, horrified. "But it's freezing. We'll die out there." "Not if we move quickly," Henry replied. "And not if you're willing to face the truth." Emma looked at the others, her heart pounding. "If it means ending this nightmare, I'll do it." One by one, the others agreed, though fear lingered in their expressions. Henry handed them each a flask filled with warm tea. "Drink this. It'll keep you warm. For a little while at least." With renewed determination and a growing sense of dread, they prepared to make the perilous journey back to Donner Lake. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the path ahead promised only danger and uncertainty. But staying behind wasn't an option. The journey to Donner Lake was grueling, each step a battle against the relentless storm. The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at their faces and stealing their breath. Snow swirled around them in blinding flurries, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Henry led the way with unshakable resolve, his lantern casting a feeble glow that barely pierced the darkness. Behind him, the 5 friends trudged forward, their bodies numb with cold but their spirits driven by desperation. When they finally reached the frozen expanse of the lake, Emma felt her chest tighten. It was as if the very air carried the weight of what had happened here years ago. The surface of the ice was cracked and uneven, its pale sheen reflecting the dim light of the lantern. In the distance, The skeletal remains of an old dock jutted out into the water, its wooden planks splintered and rotted. "This is where it happened," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. Henry nodded solemnly. "Stand at the edge of the ice. Call her name." Emma hesitated, her heart pounding. She knew this moment would come, yet nothing could have prepared her for the raw terror coursing through her veins. Taking a shaky step forward, she stopped just short of the jagged cracks in the ice. Closing her eyes, she called out into the void. "Anna, I'm sorry." Her voice cracked under the strain of emotion. "I should have stayed. I should have helped you." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the wind died down abruptly, as though the storm itself were holding its breath. The temperature plummeted further, and the surface of the lake began to shimmer faintly, as if responding to her words. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping onto the ice with slow, deliberate movements. It was Anna, the girl in the red coat. Her face was pale and sorrowful, her hollow eyes fixed on Emma. She didn't speak, but her presence filled the air with an overwhelming sense of grief. "I'm so sorry," Emma repeated, tears streaming down her face. "I ran because I was scared, but I never forgot about you. I think about you every day." Anna tilted her head slightly, studying Emma with an expression that was neither forgiving nor accusatory. Then, without warning, she extended her hand, pointing toward the center of the lake. "What does she want?" Daniel asked, his voice trembling. "She wants me to go out there," Emma realized, her stomach sinking. "No!" Sarah exclaimed, grabbing Emma's arm. "It's too dangerous. The ice won't hold." "I have to," Emma interrupted, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "This is my fault. If I don't do this, none of us will make it out alive." Before anyone could stop her, Emma stepped onto the ice. Each movement sent sharp cracks radiating outward, the sound echoing ominously across the frozen surface. She moved cautiously, her gaze locked on Anna, who stood waiting silently. When Emma reached the center of the lake, she stopped, standing mere feet away from the apparition. The whispers returned, louder now, swirling around her like a vortex of voices. They weren't angry anymore. They sounded pleading, desperate. "Help me?" Anna whispered, her voice breaking through the chaos. Emma knelt down, placing her hands on the ice. "Tell me what to do." Anna pointed downward, toward the dark depths below. Understanding dawned on Emma's face, and she nodded. Turning back to the others, she shouted, "We need to break the ice. We need to free her." Daniel and Chris exchanged uncertain glances but quickly joined Emma on the ice, using their boots and whatever tools they had to chip away at the frozen surface. The others followed suit, working together despite the danger. The ice groaned and shifted beneath their weight, threatening to give way at any moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a large section of the ice shattered, plunging into the icy water below. A rush of energy surged upward, carrying with it a torrent of water and debris. For a brief moment, the lake seemed alive, glowing with an ethereal light. Anna's form flickered, becoming translucent before dissolving completely into the water. The whispers faded, replaced by an eerie stillness. The storm above began to subside, the clouds parting to reveal a star-filled sky. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, the group stumbled back to shore, collapsing onto the snow-covered ground. Henry watched them silently, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "It's over," he said simply. Days later, the survivors recounted their harrowing ordeal to local authorities, though much of their story was met with skepticism. No evidence of Anna's body was ever found, and the cabin was condemned shortly thereafter, deemed unsafe for habitation. Emma returned home changed, burdened by the memories of that night but also relieved to have faced her guilt. She visited Donner Lake often in the years that followed, leaving flowers by the water's edge in quiet remembrance. As for the others, they drifted apart, each carrying their own scars from the nightmare they had endured. But one thing remained certain. None of them would ever forget the chilling events of that fateful December night, or the girl in the red coat who haunted the frozen lake. And sometimes, on quiet winter nights, when the wind whispered through the trees, Emma swore she could hear Anna's voice, soft and distant, thanking her. Snowfall in California. A chilling discovery beneath the Sierra Nevada, December 1983. The winter of 1983 was unlike any other in the small town of Truckee, nestled high in the Sierra Nevada mountains of Northern California. Known for its picturesque landscapes and ski resorts, the region had always been a haven for outdoor enthusiasts. But that year, an unusually heavy snowstorm blanketed the area, burying everything under several feet of snow. It was during this relentless storm that something long hidden, and perhaps intentionally forgotten, was revealed. On the morning of December 14th, a local park ranger named Ethan Caldwell set out on his routine patrol near Donner Memorial State Park. The air was frigid, sharp enough to sting exposed skin, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of tree branches weighed down by snow. Ethan had lived in Truckee his entire life and thought he knew every inch of the terrain. Yet, as he trudged through the deep drifts, he noticed something odd protruding from beneath the icy crust. A dark, jagged shape that didn't belong to the natural landscape. At first, he assumed it was debris from a fallen tree or perhaps remnants of an old abandoned structure. But as he brushed away the snow with gloved hands, his stomach tightened. What emerged was not wood or stone but metal, rusted, twisted, and eerily cold to the touch. It appeared to be part of a vehicle, though its exact make and model were obscured by time and corrosion. The sight sent a shiver down his spine, not just because of the biting wind but because of the unsettling realization that this object had likely been buried for decades. Ethan called for backup immediately, his voice crackling over the radio as he described the scene. By mid-afternoon, a team of investigators arrived, equipped with shovels and chainsaws to clear away the dense layers of snow and ice. As more of the wreckage came into view, the atmosphere grew heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. It wasn't just a car. It was an old station wagon, its paint faded beyond recognition and windows shattered. Inside, personal belongings were scattered. A child's doll, a tattered suitcase, and what looked like fragments of clothing frozen stiff by years of sub-zero temperatures. The discovery quickly drew attention from nearby residents, many of whom gathered at a safe distance, whispering among themselves. Some recognized the license plate, partially intact despite the decay. It belonged to a family who had vanished without a trace nearly 20 years earlier, the Millers. James Miller, his wife Margaret, and their two young children had left Sacramento one winter weekend in 1965, heading to Lake Tahoe for a holiday getaway. They never returned. Their disappearance became one of the most baffling mysteries in California history, sparking countless searches and theories but yielding no answers, until now. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow-covered expanse, the mood shifted from curiosity to dread. The investigators worked tirelessly under floodlights, their breath visible in the freezing air. One of them, Detective Laura Mendez, knelt beside the open trunk of the car, her expression unreadable. She reached inside cautiously, pulling out a leather-bound journal wrapped in plastic. Its pages were brittle, some crumbling at the slightest touch, but the handwriting within was still legible. What they read chilled them to the bone. The entries detailed a harrowing account of desperation and fear, written by Margaret Miller. Her words painted a picture of a family stranded in the wilderness, running out of food and warmth, and making increasingly desperate decisions to survive. But there were also hints of something darker, references to arguments, accusations, and ultimately, a decision that could never be undone. By the time the team decided to call it a night, the snow began to fall again, covering the site as if nature itself wanted to conceal the truth once more. Ethan stood nearby, watching silently as the investigators packed up their equipment. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had only scratched the surface of what lay beneath, not just physically, but emotionally. Whatever secrets the Millers had carried with them into the mountains, they were far from resolved. And then, as Ethan turned to leave, he heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the howling wind. It was a whisper, soft yet insistent, coming from somewhere deep within the woods. Ethan froze in his tracks, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The sound wasn't natural. It didn't belong to the rustling branches or the creaking snow-laden pines. It was too deliberate, too human. Or at least it sounded like it once had been human. He glanced over his shoulder toward the group of investigators packing up their gear near the wrecked station wagon. But they were too far away to hear him if he called out. Besides, something about the sound made him hesitate. It wasn't a cry for help. It was more like a murmur, fragmented and disjointed, as though carried by the wind from some distant place or time. "Hello," Ethan called out cautiously, his voice barely above a whisper. His breath fogged in front of him, dissipating into the cold night air. He took a step forward, boots crunching softly against the snow. The sound seemed to come from deeper within the forest, where the trees grew denser and the shadows stretched longer. Against his better judgment, he followed it. The farther he walked, the more the atmosphere changed. The crisp, open expanse near the road gave way to an oppressive stillness beneath the canopy of towering pines. The snow here was thinner, patchy, revealing patches of frozen earth that crunched underfoot. The faint glow of the floodlights faded behind him, leaving only the pale light of the moon filtering through the branches. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but curiosity, or perhaps something darker, kept him moving forward. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled into a small clearing. At its center stood an old, weathered cabin, half buried in snow and leaning precariously to one side. Its wooden walls were warped and splintered, and the roof sagged as though ready to collapse under the weight of decades of neglect. A single, broken window stared out like a hollow eye, reflecting the dim moonlight. Something about the structure felt wrong. Not just abandoned, but tainted, as if it had witnessed things no building ever should. Ethan hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight clipped to his belt. Before he could switch it on, however, the whisper returned, louder this time, came from inside the cabin. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleading, desperate, and tinged with sorrow. It tugged at him, pulling him closer despite every rational thought urging him to leave. As he approached the cabin, the air grew colder, unnaturally so. His breath came faster now, visible clouds forming in rapid succession. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking faintly as though nudged by an unseen force. He pushed it open further, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The interior was even darker than he'd expected, the moonlight barely penetrating the grime-coated windows. The scent of damp wood and mildew filled the air, mingling with something else, something metallic and sharp. Blood? He couldn't be sure. His flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing remnants of a life long forgotten. A rusted stove, a table overturned and split down the middle, chairs scattered haphazardly. And then, in the corner, he saw it. A pile of blankets, matted and stiff with age. Beneath the blankets lay a shape, human-sized, frozen solid. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he moved closer, his footsteps hesitant. He knelt beside the shape and reached out, brushing away the top layer of fabric. What he uncovered made him recoil in horror. It was a body, or what remained of one. The face was gaunt, the skin stretched tight over bone, eyes wide and staring as though locked in eternal terror. Frost clung to the figure's hair and clothing, preserving it in a macabre state of suspended animation. But what truly unsettled him was the expression. Not of peace, but of sheer, unrelenting anguish. And then, as if sensing his presence, the body moved. A low, guttural sound emanated from the corpse, a sound that shouldn't have been possible. Ethan scrambled backward, his flashlight slipping from his grasp and rolling across the floor. The beam landed on the wall, illuminating something he hadn't noticed before. Crude symbols carved into the wood, darkened with what looked like dried blood. They pulsed faintly in the flickering light, as though alive. Outside, the wind howled louder, shaking the cabin violently. Snow began to fall again, heavier this time, sealing off the world beyond the clearing. Ethan knew he needed to get out, to warn the others, but the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. They surrounded him now, overlapping and discordant, each voice carrying fragments of a story he didn't want to hear. One voice, however, rose above the rest. Clear. Familiar. Help us. It was Margaret Miller's voice. Ethan's blood ran cold. He knew that voice, or at least, he recognized it from the journal entries they had uncovered earlier that day. Margaret Miller's words had been haunting enough on paper, but hearing her voice now, here, in this desolate cabin, was something else entirely. It wasn't just a plea. It was a demand, laced with desperation and an undercurrent of something darker, something accusatory. "Margaret?" he whispered, his voice trembling despite his effort to stay composed. The name felt foreign on his lips, as though speaking it aloud might summon something he couldn't control. And yet, deep down, he already knew he was too late for that. Whatever force had drawn him here, whatever presence lingered in this cursed place, it had been waiting for him. The body on the floor twitched again, its frozen limbs shifting unnaturally. A low moan escaped its cracked lips, and Ethan stumbled back, his boots slipping on the icy wooden floor. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room before steadying once more. In the brief flashes of light, he caught glimpses of other shapes, other bodies, huddled in the corners of the cabin. They were barely visible beneath layers of frost and decay, their faces obscured but their postures unmistakably human. Each one seemed to be staring directly at him. "No," Ethan muttered, shaking his head as if trying to dispel the image. "This isn't real. This can't be. Why did you come here?" Margaret's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp and accusatory. The tone sent a jolt of fear through him, rooting him to the spot. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the room, searching for the source of the sound. But there was no one, just the corpses, just the symbols carved into the walls, glowing faintly now with an eerie, pulsating light. I didn't mean to," Ethan stammered, his voice barely audible over the rising wind outside. "I heard. I thought someone needed help." A bitter laugh echoed through the cabin, reverberating off the walls and making the hair on his arms stand on end. "Help!" Margaret's voice spat the word like venom. "You think you can help us? After all these years? After what you did?" Ethan's breath hitched. "What I did? I don't even know who you are. I wasn't even born when—" "Liar!" The single word exploded in the confined space, rattling the windows and sending a cascade of snow sliding off the roof. The temperature plummeted further, so suddenly that Ethan could see his breath freezing in midair. He clutched at his coat, pulling it tighter around himself, but the cold wasn't just physical. It seeped into his bones, into his very soul. "You left us here," Margaret continued, her voice softer now but infinitely more menacing. "You promised we'd find shelter. You said we'd be safe. But you lied." Ethan shook his head violently, backing toward the door. "No, you've got the wrong person. I wasn't part of your family. I don't know anything about what happened to you." For a moment there was silence. The wind died down and the whispers ceased. Even the symbols on the walls dimmed, their glow fading into darkness. Ethan dared to hope that whatever malevolent force had taken hold of the cabin had released him. But then the body on the floor began to rise. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, joints cracking audibly as it pushed itself upright. Frost flaked away from its skin, revealing flesh that was gray and leathery, stretched tight over exposed bone. Its hollow eyes locked onto Ethan, and a twisted smile spread across its face, a grotesque parody of humanity. "You're lying," Margaret hissed, her voice emanating not just from the corpse but from everywhere at once. "You were there. You led us here. You abandoned us." Ethan fumbled for the door handle behind him, his fingers numb and clumsy. "I swear, I don't know what you're talking about. I wasn't there. I wasn't." Before he could finish, the cabin shuddered violently, throwing him off balance. The walls groaned as though the structure itself were alive, straining against some unseen force. The symbols flared back to life, brighter than before, bathing the room in an unholy red light. Shadows danced wildly, twisting and contorting into shapes that defied logic. Faces screamed silently within them, their mouths open wide in agony. And then, the whispers returned. Not just Margaret's voice now, but dozens, maybe hundreds of others. They spoke in unison, their words overlapping in a cacophony of despair and rage. "You will remember." The floor beneath Ethan gave way with a deafening crack, plunging him into darkness. For a moment he was weightless, falling through nothingness. Then, with brutal force, he hit solid ground. Pain shot through his body, and he gasped for air, his lungs burning. When he opened his eyes, he found himself no longer in the cabin, but somewhere far worse. He was standing in the middle of a dense forest, the trees towering impossibly high above him. Their branches intertwined to form a canopy so thick that no light could penetrate it. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and earth, but also something metallic, blood. Snow blanketed the ground, pristine and untouched, save for a single set of footprints leading away from him. Ethan followed the trail instinctively, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked, fragments of memory began to surface, unbidden and unwelcome. Images flashed before his eyes. A car stuck in the snow, a family huddled around a dying fire, a map torn in half. Voices whispered in his mind, familiar yet distant, urging him forward. At the end of the trail he found another clearing and another cabin. This one looked newer, less decayed, but no less ominous. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows, beckoning him closer. Against all reason, he felt compelled to enter. As he reached for the doorknob, a child's laughter rang out from inside, sweet and innocent, followed by a scream. Ethan hesitated, his hand hovering inches from the door. Deep down, he knew what waited for him beyond it. But he also knew he had no choice. The past had found him, and it wasn't done with him yet. Ethan's fingers trembled as they brushed against the cold metal of the doorknob. The laughter from inside had ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against his ears like a physical weight. He could feel the warmth radiating from the other side of the door, a stark contrast to the biting chill of the forest. It should have been inviting, comforting even, but it wasn't. Instead, it felt wrong, unnatural, as though the heat carried with it the promise of something far more sinister. He turned the knob slowly, each click echoing in the stillness around him. The hinges creaked as the door swung inward, revealing a scene that made his stomach churn. The cabin was cozy, almost idyllic. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the walls. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the air with the scent of stew. A child's doll sat propped up on a small wooden table, its painted smile eerily wide. Everything looked perfect, untouched by time or decay. But then he saw them, the Millers. They were seated around the table, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow. James Miller slumped forward, his head resting on his arms as if asleep. Margaret sat rigidly beside him, her hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white. And in the corner, two small figures, children, huddled close to each other, their wide eyes staring blankly ahead. None of them moved, yet Ethan could feel their presence pressing down on him, suffocating in its intensity. "Why are you here?" Margaret's voice broke the silence, sharp and accusatory. She didn't look at him, but her words cut through the room like a knife. "You shouldn't be here." Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. I don't understand," he stammered. "This isn't real. You're dead. All of you." Margaret finally turned her head, her gaze locking onto his. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of sorrow and fury intertwined. "Dead?" she repeated, her tone dripping with venom. "Do you think death frees us from what we've done? From what you made us do?" "I didn't make you do anything," Ethan shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. "I wasn't even alive back then. How can you blame me for something I had no part in?" The room seemed to shudder at his outburst, the fire in the hearth flaring violently before dimming to embers. The shadows stretched longer, darker, swallowing the light. The dolls on the table twitched, its glassy eyes rolling toward him as though alive. The children in the corner began to whimper, soft at first, then louder, until their cries filled the cabin like a chorus of lost souls. "You led us here," Margaret said again, her voice low and steady now, cutting through the noise. "You promised safety, shelter, but all you gave us was despair." Ethan shook his head, backing away toward the door. His mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of memory that had surfaced earlier. The car stuck in the snow, the map torn in half, the family huddled around a dying fire. None of it made sense. He hadn't been there. He couldn't have been. And yet, the guilt gnawing at the edges of his consciousness told him otherwise. "I don't know what you want from me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wailing. "I can't fix this. I can't undo what happened." "You can remember," Margaret said, rising from her seat. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though every step required immense effort. "That's all we ask. Remember what you took from us." As she approached, the others followed suit. James stood stiffly, his face slack but his eyes burning with accusation. The children crept closer, their tiny hands reaching out toward him. Ethan backed further into the corner, his escape blocked by the wall behind him. Panic surged through him as the realization hit. They weren't just asking for remembrance. They wanted vengeance. And then, just as Margaret reached out to touch him, the world shifted. The cabin dissolved into darkness, leaving Ethan suspended in a void. The voices returned, louder and more chaotic than before, swirling around him like a storm. Images flashed before his eyes, faces screaming, hands clawing at the snow, blood staining the pristine white ground. He saw himself, younger, standing at the edge of a frozen lake, holding a map. The Miller station wagon was parked nearby, its headlights cutting through the night. They begged him for help, pleaded with him to guide them safely to shelter. But instead of leading them to safety, he walked away, leaving them to die. "No," Ethan whispered, clutching his head as the memories flooded back. "That wasn't me. That couldn't have been me." But deep down, he knew it was true. Somehow, someway, he had been there, whether through a past life, a forgotten connection, or something far stranger. He had played a role in their fate. And now they had come to ensure he never forgot. When the darkness lifted, Ethan found himself back in the original cabin, the one buried beneath the snow. The bodies were gone, but the symbols on the walls glowed brighter than ever, pulsating with a malevolent energy. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter, childlike, innocent, and utterly devoid of joy. Ethan sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had remembered. The truth was unbearable, but forgetting was no longer an option. The miller's suffering had become his burden to bear, and as the whispers grew louder, circling him like vultures, he realized something far worse. This was only the beginning. The cabin seemed to close in around Ethan, the walls groaning as though alive, the symbols etched into the wood burning brighter with each passing second. The air grew heavier, pressing down on him until it was hard to breathe. He could feel the weight of countless eyes upon him, accusing, demanding, unrelenting. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, Margaret's voice, sharp and cold as the winter wind outside. "You remember now," she said, her tone devoid of emotion. "And now you'll carry it forever." Ethan wanted to scream, to deny what he had seen, but the truth was seared into his mind like a brand. He had been there, in some form or another, complicit in their suffering. Whether through fate, karma, or something far darker, he had been chosen to bear witness to their torment, and to ensure that their story would never be forgotten. As the realization sank in, the cabin began to collapse inward, the wooden beams splintering and cracking under an unseen force. The glowing symbols flared one last time, bathing the room in blinding light before everything went dark. Ethan felt himself falling once more, tumbling through endless voids, until finally, he landed with a jolt. He woke up lying in the snow near Donner Memorial State Park, the wreckage of the Miller family station wagon just a few feet away. The investigators were gone, their equipment packed up and taken back to town. The floodlights had been extinguished, leaving only the pale glow of the moon to illuminate the scene. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare, a vivid, horrifying hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the forest. But then he noticed the journal clutched tightly in his hand. It wasn't the same leather-bound book they had recovered earlier. This one was newer, its pages crisp and unmarked. Trembling, Ethan opened it to find the first page filled with his own handwriting. The words were jagged, frantic, as though written in haste. Asterisk, I led them here. I promised them safety. I left them to die. Asterisk. Below the text was a crude sketch of the map he had seen in his vision, the same map that had guided the Millers to their doom. His hands shook as he flipped through the rest of the pages, each one blank but waiting, as if anticipating future entries. Future sins. A sudden gust of wind tore the journal from his grasp, sending it spiraling into the darkness beyond the treeline. Ethan scrambled to his feet, shouting after it, but it was already gone, swallowed by the night. As he stood there, breathless and disoriented, he heard it again, the laughter. Faint at first, then growing louder, echoing all around him. From the shadows of the trees emerged figures, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They moved slowly, deliberately, their faces obscured by hoods and scarves. One by one, they stepped into the moonlight, revealing familiar features. Gaunt cheeks, hollow eyes, frostbitten skin. The Millers. Margaret stepped forward, her expression unreadable. Behind her, James held the children close, their tiny hands clutching his coat. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to convey their intent. Ethan backed away, his boots crunching against the snow, but there was nowhere to run. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a labyrinth of shadows and silence. And yet, even as fear gripped his heart, he felt something else stirring within him, a strange sense of resignation. He had remembered. He had carried their burden. Now it was time to face the consequences. Margaret reached out, her hand brushing against his cheek. Her touch was icy, but not painful. It was final. "You'll join us," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "You'll tell our story." Before Ethan could respond, the world dissolved once more, plunging him into darkness. When he opened his eyes again, he found himself standing in the middle of a dense forest, surrounded by towering pines and blanketed in fresh snow. In his hand, he held a map, torn and weathered, marked with trails leading deeper into the wilderness. The laughter of children echoed in the distance, sweet and innocent, drawing him forward. He took a step, then another following the sound. Each footfall left a perfect imprint in the snow, pristine and untouched. As he walked, he realized he was no longer alone. Figures moved among the trees, their faces obscured but their intentions clear. They were watching him, guiding him, ensuring he stayed on the path. When he reached the clearing, he saw it. A cabin, half buried in snow, its windows glowing warmly despite the chill. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the faint scent of stew wafted through the air. Inside, he knew, waited the Millers, waiting for him to take his place among them. Ethan hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click, sealing him off from the outside world. From somewhere deep within the cabin, the laughter of children rang out, mingling with the crackle of the fire. Outside, the snow began to fall again, covering the clearing and erasing any trace of his arrival. By morning, the cabin was gone, buried beneath layers of snow and ice. To anyone who passed by, it would seem as though nothing had ever been there. But those who ventured too close might hear faint whispers carried on the wind, or catch a glimpse of figures moving between the trees, their faces pale and their eyes hollow. And so, the cycle continued. In Truckee, the locals spoke of the strange disappearance of Ranger Ethan Caldwell, speculating about avalanches or wild animals. But some claimed to have seen him afterward, wandering the forests near Donner Memorial State Park, his face pale and drawn, his eyes empty. Others reported hearing laughter in the woods late at night, followed by the distant echo of footsteps crunching through the snow. As for the journal, it resurfaced years later, tucked inside the glove compartment of an abandoned car found miles away from civilization. Its pages were filled with frantic scribbles and sketches, detailing journeys into the wilderness and encounters with shadowy figures. On the final page, scrawled in jagged handwriting, were 3 simple words: asterisk, remember us all, asterisk. And when the finder of the journal tried to investigate further, they vanished without a trace, leaving behind only footprints in the snow, and the faint sound of laughter fading into the wind.